and welcome to Once Upon a Town, a deep dive into the history of Franklin, Mass. I'm Eamon McCarthy Earls.
I'm Joe Landry.
On today's episode, we're taking a look at the Morse Block, a hub of cultural life in downtown Franklin for decades and site of two of the town's most famous movie theaters through the years. The Morse Block was the site of many famous businesses in Franklin through the years, particularly for arts and entertainment. The Morse Opera House is one that we'll talk a lot about today, but many people will also remember the Zoetrope movie theater, which stood until about 2006 at the far corner of this block of buildings.
That's right.
Joe, you've done a lot of great research on the Morse Block. Can you tell me a little bit about the origin of this part of downtown?
Absolutely. Well, the Morse Block, as we know, is located on East Central Street, between Summer Street and Cottage Street. And the block was owned by a gentleman by the name of Aaron Hartwell Morse. And he was born in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1819, and he died in Franklin in 1895 at the age of 76 years. And he's the one that developed the Morse Block. And he owned a lot of property in Franklin, as a matter of fact. What we see here is a picture of the Morse Block as it appears today. I took this from Google Earth. You know, some people like these drones and everything, but the Google Earth is great for showing in areas of downtown Franklin, and I use that a lot in my presentations. And we can see the space where the cinema, the Franklin Cinema, used to be.
The green grassy area on the left-hand side of the image.
That's right. That's right. Now, Aaron Hartwell Morse owned a lot of property in Franklin. And as you can see from this old map, you can see all the properties that he owned. A couple of them that I'll draw your attention to, the house that was on the corner of Summer Street and East Central Street was known as the Hawthorne, and that was his residence. And
that was a pretty magnificent mansion house that he lived in, which we'll see a few photos of later on.
Exactly. In fact, they built a gas station right on his front lawn, and it became the Morse Saccone station, and eventually Ray Brown bought that, and it became a Brown service station.
Clearly always an eye for business, even with his own very, very, very fancy house. If he could make a buck off some gasoline, he would do it.
Absolutely. And the other building that I would point to is up the street, just past Cross Street on the left. I was approached by Greg and Laura Lewis. They own that house today. And actually, he approached me on Facebook, and he asked me if I could do some research on his house, because it turns out that the Massachusetts Historical Commission still carries that house as part of their inventory. And he wanted to do some work inside the house. He wanted to redo the bathroom. But he needed permission from the Historical Commission in order to do that, which he did get, and he went ahead and he did the work. But he thought it was really cool that they referred to his house as the A. Hartwell Morse House. So he asked me if I'd do some research. I went back to this old map, and sure enough, Aaron Hartwell Morse did own that house, and there it is. So I thought he thought that was pretty cool. So, yeah. And then this picture here is taken from the 1879 map. You can see that it was built. This map dates back to before the Morse Opera House block was even developed. And one thing I would point out, it says Central Street. There was no East Central or West Central Street. That didn't happen until 1911. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
And it looks like in this image, not quite a full-fledged farmhouse, but some sort of house with a little cupola on top of it was on that site originally.
Yeah.
And have you ever heard any stories about what the deal was with that tower in the background? You can sort of see it in the central lower part of the image.
I know that.
And I've seen it on other aerial maps of Franklin from both 1879 and 1888, but I've never heard any references to that tower. It seems to be one of those mysteries lost to time in our community.
The mystery goes on because I don't know either, but I'm keeping an eye out for that. I'd love to know that myself. I really don't know. Yeah. And then the 1888 map of Franklin shows the Morse Block has just been developed. In fact, it was developed about a year before that. So this is a brand new opera house. And you can see there's a building on the corner of Cottage Street. And that building actually had a courthouse in it. Franklin had the district court for many years until they moved it to Rentham. And the Morse Opera House was there. Morse Opera House also had, it was up on the second floor. The first floor had different stores down in there. And we'll talk about some of those as we go on. But the Morse Opera House was a level floor. It was not a pitched floor like you would have in a theater. And eventually, when they started showing movies, from what I was reading, it was kind of difficult to watch movies in there, but they still did. But it mostly was used for plays and graduations. A lot of high school graduations were held there. In fact, when the Catholic Church had a big fire in 1900, when the church burned down, they held Catholic Mass there for a while there too. So, and then we're going to be talking about the Sanborn insurance fire maps,
which are basically a bird's eye view right inside the walls of some of these properties, including the Morse Block.
Right.
They give a sense of who was in there, what the rough layout of some of the rooms and floors were like at that point in time.
So much so, they even tell you what side of the building that the stage was located on. It was located on the Summer Street side of the building. And you can see there was a conference room up on the second floor of the building on the corner. The third floor, there was a hall. And as part of my research, I keep seeing reference to the Central Square Hall. And Central Square was that area of land right out in front of the Morse Opera House. So that must have been that hall that they referred to there. But there was different businesses in those locations.
What were some of the other tenants in the Morse Block at that point in time when the map was created?
Well, we're going to be talking about those in a few minutes. One of them, probably the most popular one, was Bartlett and Fales. A lot of ice cream was sold in that place, and we will be talking about that when we get going. But this is a pretty good map. These Sanborn maps, they show the footprint of the buildings and to very, very accurate scale. And they've been a very valuable source of information for me in doing my research. Now I talked about East Central Street and West Central Street. Back in 1911, the town went through a renumbering system where they just totally renumbered a lot of the businesses and houses in the downtown area. I can tell you from personal experience, my home on Dean Avenue was pretty close to town. And I noticed in a lot of the references, I kept noticing it was at 249 Dean Avenue. And I didn't live at 249 Dean Avenue, I lived at 30 Dean Avenue. And Dr. Solon Abbott had lived there for many years. In fact, my parents bought the house from him in 1949. But every time I saw Dr. Solon Abbott's name listed and his residence, it was 249 Dean Avenue, except in 1913, it was 30 Dean Avenue. So I said, okay, so between 1909 and 1913, that's when this change occurred. And so after really, really looking, and then I saw this map, and this explained it. It explained that when they did the renumbering system, if you look at this map, you'll see these little lines. Those little lines indicate 25-foot increments. And what they would do is they would assign the numbers, and you can see the numbers written in. Well, take the Morse Block, for example. You see 12, 14, 16, 18. Those are increments, and that's what determined the number for that particular business that was there. If the front door was on, I've noticed if the front door was on number 12, that's where, like, so Bartlett and Fales was on that corner, was 12 East Central Street. Now, that was also the year that Central Street was divided into East Central and West Central, and they started at the bridge. So you'll notice that the numbers started at the bridge and went towards Rentham, and odd numbers on one side, even on the other.
Do you have a sense of why 1911 brought these big changes in the numbering of houses and the sort of split in Central Street within downtown Franklin?
I'm not really sure, but I'm going to do some more research on this, but I have a feeling that back in those days, when you got mail, I don't think the mail was really delivered to your house by a mailman. I think you pretty much had to go downtown to the post office to get your mail. I'm not exactly sure of that, or when that had to happen at some point. And I'm wondering if this was a result of that, where they had to renumber. They did it for a reason, and I'm not really sure what the reason was, but they did it, and there it is. So the only exception I will tell you is on streets like Depot Street, Dean Avenue, each of those lines represented 25-foot increments. On Main Street, from Emmett Street to the bridge, and East Central Street from the bridge to Summer Street, there were 20-foot increments instead of 25-foot increments. That was the only rule change. Other than that, there were 25-foot increments. So now here's the Morse Opera House block, as we see. It looks. I'm thinking it's early 1900s, maybe. As I mentioned, the district court was in the building on the corner of Cottage Street. In December of 1933, there was a discussion about moving the court to Rentham. But Franklin's contention was that the court was more centrally located where it was there.
Unfortunately, Franklin lost out on that, and in 1936, the court moved to Rentham, where it's remained ever since.
Exactly. I read an article where Franklin was really going to put up a fight, but in the end, I guess we lost. So, what are you going to do? Here's a picture that I saw recently that it shows the Morse Opera House from a different angle that I've never seen before. And I thought it's really nice. And I would also point out that you see the empty space that's right next to the Opera House. We're going to be talking about, there was a possibility that they were going to build an actual movie theater in that location in 1926. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But you can see the empty space that was there when the Morse Opera House was there. So, now here is the building on the corner of Summer Street and East Central Street. This was the building that was known as the Hawthorne, and at the time that this picture was taken, Aaron Morse owned it.
And it really is a beautiful property. You can see just how different this section of East Central Street was at that point in time. There's a lot more shade trees and a little bit of a different road lineup. The road's a little narrower than it is today in that area.
Right. You can see Summer Street right there. And then here's an advertisement that I got from one of the residents and business books of Franklin. And it talks about H.E. Ruggles. This would be Henry Ruggles. And he was a lawyer. And eventually he became a judge. And he was up in the Morse Block. And he eventually became a judge in the courthouse. So, and we're talking about some of the businesses that were in the Morse Opera House block at that time. One very prominent businessman was Harry Bullocken. He bought up a lot of land in Franklin, downtown, and in Franklin in general. And we'll be talking more about some of the property that Harry bought in future episodes. But his first business was started in 1899 right here in the Morse Opera House block. It was called Franklin Cash Store. And he sold coal and grain and meat and groceries. And so that's how he made his fortune. And this is a picture that shows the store right there. He had to close the store in 1943, however, because this was just after World War II began, and apparently there was difficulty for rationing and things. So it placed a heavy burden on the small private store owner. So, but he did keep his coal and oil business open, and that would be carried on, and eventually his son would carry on in that business. So, one other business that was in the Opera House block was the Davis Department Store. Harry Davis owned this store. And this advertisement, it was taken from July 16th, 1925, Franklin Sentinel. Eventually, he would move that store to 44 Main Street, which is directly across the street from today's post office. Some people might remember when Thunderbird Cleaners was in that location. When we talk about that block, we'll see pictures of the Davis Department Store when it was in that block.
So we've seen all kinds of businesses come through the Morse Block, and you have some other great images here that show some of the businesses at the sort of 1920s time frame.
This particular picture was taken in 1928, and it shows Bartlett and Fales was there at that time. And as I say, that was a very popular place. They didn't just sell ice cream; they had a soda fountain there, but they did sell other things. But they were most noted for the ice cream. So. One of the things that the Morse Opera House was good at, as I mentioned before, was high school graduations. And I was able to get a copy of the program from 1890. This was in June 26th of 1890, and they had 13 graduates that year. So, and as I mentioned, Catholic Mass was held there when the church burnt down in 1900. So that was some of the things that would be shown in the Morse Opera House. And then when silent movies came along, in 1925, a very popular movie at that time was The Ten Commandments. That was one of Cecil B. DeMille's first big productions.
One of the giants of the silent era from a producer-director standpoint.
Exactly. This advertisement shows when it was held on October 14th and 15th of 1925. And as I mentioned, I read where it was really difficult to watch movies in the Opera House, but they did. Some of the prices, 25 cents, 50 cents. Yeah.
Geez, I wish movies were still that price these days.
Wow. And then another silent movie that was held there was the Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney. So that was shown in 1926. So, and as I mentioned, in the late 1926, a new movie theater was proposed for that empty lot. The selectmen said it's okay to have the project, but they said they didn't want any stores in that new building. They felt that empty stores would not add to the appearance of the streets. They didn't want any empty stores, and they said, we have enough stores. However, in February of 1928, disaster would strike. And this was the front page of the Franklin Sentinel back in 1928. A huge fire, and it ruined the Opera House block. And the damage was $250,000 now.
Which in today's money, with inflation, is probably 10 or 12 times more than that amount. Millions and millions of dollars of property damage.
Exactly. The blaze was discovered up in the balcony of the theater while the afternoon show was in progress.
And luckily, no lives were lost.
No lives were lost. No. In fact, it's funny. What happened was they discovered the fire, and the woman on the piano, her name was Mrs. Costello, kept playing the piano to kind of keep children calm while they all got out of there, and they all did. But the structure was heavily damaged, and here's a picture that was taken probably the day after. There's a woman in town. She's the mother of one of my classmates, Nancy Emery. She was like 4 or 5 years old at that time, and she lived on Alpine Row. And she remembers the Morse Opera House fire. In fact, she was up on the shoulders of her grandfather during the fire. She remembers it. She distinctly remembers that, and it's really something. Mrs. Louise Costello is the woman that was playing the piano. There's a very popular newspaper reporter that was in Franklin. His name was Woody Abbott. Woody Abbott was a young man. He was also in there at the time of the fire, and he got out. So, but just a little piece of Franklin trivia for you. So, yeah. And then, now that fire happened in February, and this is from April of 2 months later. The new Morse Opera House was rising steadily from the ashes. They were building the new theater, which would become the Morse Theater. It wasn't really an opera house. It was the new theater. So, and at this time, the Morse estate was detailing plans for this new Morse house, the foundations of which are now being laid. And now they're going to have a pitched floor so that people can see it.
So you don't have to crane your neck anymore to watch movies.
Exactly, right. And it's going to have a beautiful entrance and lobby. It's going to be brilliantly illuminated and pitched floor, safety, convenience, and comfort carefully considered. So they're putting a lot of thought into it.
That's a remarkably swift rebuild after that much damage being done.
Oh.
And seems like it came just in the nick of time, too, because 1927 marked the very first year of talkies, films with sound, and
That's right.
that sort of added even more life to going to the movies with the added excitement of movies you could see and hear.
That's right. But at the time, the theater was not equipped for talkies. But and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, because I did eventually convert over to equipment for that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But look at this. Just 4 months after the fire, that new block was just about ready to accept new stores coming back. So the grand reopening of the Davis department store. Here's the advertisement that was on June 9th in 1928. It was literally 4 months after the fire. So, I mean, they really rebuilt that block very quickly. And so this is Davis department store, as I mentioned, eventually moved over to Main Street. So, and then in October, 8 months after the fire, the new Morse Theater opened up. Handsome, fireproof, complete structure.
I like how fireproof is the second thing they used to describe it.
That's right.
Probably an important point to make after the previous disaster.
Absolutely. They had 5 large exits, beautiful entrance and lobby, and so on. So that was really nice. And the first movie that was held at the new Morse Theater was The Waterhole. And that was shown on October 18th, 1928. And it was a silent movie. The talkies were still a few years away. However, in 1931, there was this advertisement that appeared in the Sun Chronicle. It said, "Come on over to Franklin and see and hear the new talkies at the Morse Theater." And so they have the new equipment in there, the Western Electric sound equipment, and a new Saracone fireproof projection screen. So the talkies were now in Franklin. And the first movie that was held there was The Royal Family of Broadway. And that was held in April of 1931. That was a movie with Frederick March. He was a popular actor in those days. So, now this really cracks me up. It has come to the attention of the police officially that someone let loose a stink bomb in the Morse Theater. Can you imagine? Somebody let loose a stink bomb in the Morse Theater.
That must have caused some chaos.
Yep. With the resultant discomfiture for patrons. Now, under some circumstances, this might be funny, but there's a time and a place for everything. And the smart Alecs who were responsible may find this out to their sorrow if the police ever learn their identity. Whoever did it may not know it, but there's a severe penalty for such acts. Can you imagine something like that being in the paper? Unbelievable.
I just find it funny the paper's printing up smart Alex.
Yeah.
That's the best insult for people who let off stink bombs in the theater.
So, in 1933, I happened to catch this. Franklin used to only have one police car at that time, and they decided to equip it with two-way radio. And so the reason I point that out is because the police station was under the theater. The Franklin Police Station was underneath the Morse Theater, and I remember that. It was there even up until the 1960s when I registered my first bicycle. I went down to register my bicycle there. But in the late 50s, the lease was running out on the police station. They had to vacate, and there was talk about putting a new police station just to the left of the existing fire station over on the corner of West Street and East Street rather, and West Central Street. But eventually they decided to buy the building that was directly behind the fire station, was the GAR Hall, and they bought that land, they tore that down, and they put the new police station there. But I thought it was interesting that the police station was under the theater.
I've certainly heard a few interesting stories about the police station when it was in the basement of the Morse Block.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most amusing was in around 1903 or 1904 during the building of the library. Some plasterers got plastered and became drunken and disorderly. They were placed in the Hoosgow by the local police, and under the cover of darkness, while Night Officer Redpath was looking the other way, their buddies came and broke them out of the jail cell.
Wow.
And they got away with it. They escaped.
Wow.
They fought the law and they won, it seems.
That's great. Wow, that's a great story. Wow. There were bowling alleys in that new block down below. It was called Central Bowling Alleys. And eventually, the owner, Al Fico, decided to move the bowling alley down to East Central Street, and he built Fico's Bowlodrome in 1954. Yeah. And then in later years, John Rizzoli would move his pharmacy over from 16 Main Street to this location at 12 East Central Street in the early 50s, right on the corner. This was about 2 or 3 years after Bartlett and Fales moved on. So he took over that spot. Eventually, Rizzoli moved his store across the street to 15 East Central Street in the building that we've come to know as the Sentinel Building. That was the East Central Street Central Building. We'll eventually talk about the Sentinel Building. It was on Depot Street in a future episode. So he moved there. And then Ron's Men's Shop was also at that location at 14 East Central Street. And in the early 50s, he would move across the street to the A.J. Cataldo building and have his shop there too. That was Ron Palumbo that ran that store. And then after Rizzoli moved out, a cleaners moved in to where his pharmacy was. And this is back again in the 50s. Now, one store that was up on Main Street was Martin's Department Store. Martin's Department Store used to be where Newberry's was, and then there was a fire in that building in 1944, and Martin's moved over to the building that was on the bridge, known as the Exchange Building. And then in 1962, they tore that building down, so Martin's moved his business over to East Central Street in this block. And the reason I remember Martin's being in this location, because when I was in high school, I had joined the high school band, and part of the uniform was wearing white pants. And Martin's was the only place you could buy the white pants in Franklin. So I remember going there to get my white pants. So I remember that Martin's being in that location. So, and I always thought that Martin's was Mr. Martin. Maybe that Martin was his last name. But no, Martin was his first name. His last name was Levine. It was Martin Levine. And so that was a little something that I didn't realize. And then in future years, there were other businesses in that block. You had a Dinello's Market on the in that block. There was a Dinello's Market on Union Street down near, at the corner of Cottage Street. I'm not really sure if that was if Dinello's Market moved here or not. I'm not really sure about that, but there was definitely a Dinello's Market here. So, and then other businesses that were in that block, the Red Lion. We used to call that the Onion. I don't know why, but it got that nickname. The Red Lion.
There must be many layers to that story.
I see what you did there. Onion peel. Anyway. And then there was Darlene's Donuts, was a very popular place. And also Big Ben's. Big Ben's sub shop was there as well. Yep. And the Franklin Cinema. The Franklin Cinema, actually I should also point out that the Morse Theater was the name of the theater that was built in 1928. In 1963, the Morse Theater reopened. It had been closed for about 4 or 5 years. But they reopened in 1963, and that advertisement shows the first movie that was shown there. It was Paul Newman in the movie The Prize. And they put that facade on the front of the building when they they reopened the theater, Franklin Cinema. And for some reason, they renamed it the Franklin Zoetrope in the late 90s, I think it was. And then, and I think it was around 2006, they decided to close it and tear it down. And that's why you have an empty space there now. So.
And obviously the lower rise section of the Morse Block, as well as the remnant of the actual Opera House itself, still stand today and are definitely a part of Franklin's vibrant downtown business community.
Absolutely.
New businesses have moved in there.
Yeah.
Most recently, we've seen Darani Grill move into the Morse Opera House itself as a new Indian restaurant. And there's been others that have been sort of stalwarts of the downtown for more than a couple decades at this point, like Hang Thai Chinese restaurant. So we'll see this block continue to evolve going forward.
Absolutely. Yep.
That brings us to the end of our deep dive on the Morse Block. I'm Eamon McCarthy Earls.
I'm Joe Landry.
Until next time, thanks for watching.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.